Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 96. I sat down with Darek Trowbridge of Old World Winery recently for a great discussion around family, farming, and caring for the soil, making natural wine before the term existed, physical and mental health, and much more. We sat down at his kitchen table in Fulton and talked for a couple hours with persimmons being turned into hoshigaki hanging near the fire. Hope you enjoy our conversation. A reminder that I have a Patreon at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast. The link is in the show notes also. If you're enjoying the podcast, any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. It's all run independent. Telling a friend or sharing on social media are great ways to help out too. Here we go. I'd love to, start at the beginning. I know your family has a long history here in the Sonoma Valley, going back a ways, and it seems you kind of hold that pretty close with you still.
Yeah, it's an interesting heritage that, there's lots of family stories about, but there was nothing ever written, nothing written down. So there's so much more story that was lost. So we hold dearly to the story that we have now. Here on the Sonoma coast, where my great grandfather came when he was 19 with his wife. They were married.
Okay. Yeah.
And I guess the impetus for coming was there wasn't land for them in Italy. And this family is especially land loving. And I definitely inherited that.
Yeah.
That's why I'm a farmer. It's just like if you have that, you kind of have to farm, because why would you farm? I jokingly say, some people, just don't understand why people would struggle forward and maybe even think farming's a stupid job because it's less pay, it's more struggle. Why would you do it? Well, it's only for love, I guess, is my only answer. So I guess that's what made this man, go through the, I believe, 3-month journey, on the boat.
Okay, yeah.
They got one suitcase each, and that was your seat the whole way, so you can imagine. I just don't even understand how that would work. And then he dropped his wife off in San Francisco to work in an Italian restaurant.
Okay.
While he came north and tried to work on the coast, and I guess they were logging and whatever, this is 1870s.
Okay.
And then I guess around the 1890s is when he found a ranch and made a deal on it. However, we don't know anything about that, and planted some grapes and brought his wife up and whatever. And then started a winery, and that winery, of course, was closed in Prohibition.
Yeah.
And that would be Martinelli Winery, which the family's on the third rendition of currently. It's been opened and closed twice before. But also the family, survived as most Italian families that were, having grapes. You have to pay for your land somehow, right? Because you still got to pay the tax at the end of the day. But so there's, I don't know how much to say officially on the air, but, there was tunnels and stills and all that, back in the day. And I think the statute of limitations is out on that one.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's probably okay now.
But the stories of that and, a brand new 1919 Hudson, which was the fastest production car for about 5 years.
Okay.
That helped things too. And then reopened the winery after 33, after Prohibition was repealed, and I think closed it in the 50s again. The market was harder in the 50s to 70s. There was another resurgence in 70s. I mean, you could imagine Prohibition just destroyed a whole heritage. Like people don't really understand how significant that was for any type of history. It was just, it's amazing to think about being legislated out of business, unique to any other country in the world. So, that ended a lot of things, ended the original course of natural winemaking, which was, everything pre-World War I was natural. Farming, winemaking, sure, there was arsenic to be used in farming. You could kill yourself with stuff, but there weren't, man-made compounds, DDT, these kinds of things until after the World Wars, and that changed everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So was wine a big part of the family growing up? I mean, I guess was it kind of all around you as a as a youngster?
Yeah, that's really at the core of my story of who I came from being, I mean, I think I was 12 was my first memory of drinking my grandfather's Zinfandel,
Okay.
which, he was distilling well into his 80s, never stopped. And he was renowned for it. He was quite good at it, making the prune brandy as well as a grape brandy. And the prune brandy is really handy because you can distill year round that way. They're dried, so you can ferment them, distill them. Whereas the other, you got to have wine and it's got to not be spoiled and all that. So he would finish the ferment with some high proof, make it something like a ruby port.
Okay.
But in the 80s, the style late harvest came to be. So where something slightly sweet, higher alcohol, which could be argued that, many California wineries have that style today and call it a still wine. And they just ratcheted down the sugar, but there's still sugar in it to make it the palate more accessible. But it's just under threshold, so you don't notice it. I make that style, but I have a wine called Era that is late harvest style. But we bottle it separately. We want you to know that's what it is. You're going to something that's slightly sweet, but it's not really sweet. But when I was 12, I think it's the first time somebody poured that in my glass and poured a little water over it. And then I was drinking that whenever the family got together. And I think that's where, I guess in my child mind, wine became the center of culture for me, and I believe it still is now in my mind. I think that our culture, whatever we call this culture in the United States, it's definitely not that. There's those that put it at the center, whether they know they're doing that or not, but it's easily lost in the way things are today. But for me, my comeuppance and what gets to how I came to be where I was that I was drinking natural wines because my grandfather didn't. It was just the way his dad, my great grandfather, taught him, and then that came from Italy and to make wine. That was all natural process. There weren't compounds to buy except for sulfur wicks, which you lit and you dropped in if you needed it.
Yeah.
And so I was drinking native yeast fermented natural wines, and fast forward to when I'm getting a master's degree in wine at Fresno State. My undergrad was in viticulture, and I was making wines. That's what I want to do. I went where I could make wine, and I just fell out of love with it. I was like, my whole history to this moment, I kind of hate it. So I don't understand what that is. And lucky for me, there was a guy, Jeff Cohn, who was there doing his thesis on native yeast fermentations. And so, I went and asked him about that, and he said, well, that's, instead of you're adding one yeast now, and if you do a native yeast ferment, then that's 25 species, on and on and on. There's so much more complexity. There's more glycerols. There's more mouthfeel. And so, I tried that, and I think that was 97.
Okay.
And I never went back. I never made, 96, there was added yeast, even though there was a native yeast that was added, a single one. There's a whole story about that, but I never added yeast again since 1997. And my palate came home, and I understood that I was a natural winemaker, but we didn't have that term in the 90s. That term came in the 2000s. And so, and so that's kind of, the family upbringing was it wasn't only philosophical as far as wine being at the center of the table, as well as physical, but also there was an engineering of my palate to that was unbeknownst to me.
Yeah, it just felt I was gonna say natural.
Yeah.
when you taste it, but like
that's right.
In multiple ways. I guess it just
that
probably felt like home. I guess, or tasted
Total.
like home.
Yeah. What lit me up earlier came back.
Yeah. You studied viticulture as well as wine production. Was the goal always to be involved in all sides of the process? I mean, before we started, you were talking where you have your name after a lot of things for the winery,
Jobs,
a lot of
Every
jobs,
job.
all the jobs. So, were you always kind of focused in taking things from the beginning all the way through, or?
I laugh at that because, I don't know what the hell the vision was, honestly. Like, sort of ignorantly just moved forward like an artist would, just trying to find what my art was, you know.
Okay.
And maybe ignorantly thinking that I'll just make money at that. You know, I mean, really, there's a whole lot of ignorance that has to be in starting what I did when I did, you know, because if I knew now, I never would, no way would I ever, you know, it just so, but then that you could say that for most things, right? Like you don't know what it is until you try it. And then, you know, everything's a job, everything, there's a bit of pain maybe in everything. And so, for me, the viticulture thing started in the 80s, you know, so I started working as soon as I got my license and I could drive to my uncle's ranches. He put me to work. So I was making money, and I'd worked since I was 11. My dad's side of the family had a canoe company. So I was at an early age really getting the idea that you put your foot out there if you want to bring $1 home, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you know, I had that work ethic, and I really liked farming, but I didn't really know that I wanted to do that. And so I just chose viticulture because I'd done it. And then I realized the love that I had for it and all this as I went through school. And then at the end, I realized I didn't want to take a job farming for somebody. And I still wanted to learn winemaking. So that's when I switched over, and, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of undergrad winemaking classes in a viticulture program back in that day. So then I had to take all the undergrad. So it was a 3-year process to get a master's degree in it. And I realized that I was being taught manufacturing.
Yeah.
Which, you know, and that was when the love sort of fell out of it. And so that's one of the reasons when I graduated and I started this winery in 98, I started as an art project where I knew no one was going to pay me to do this. So I just had to try and see, you know, and ignorantly think that, you know, I could sell that.
Yeah.
When people said, you know, your Zinfandel doesn't taste like Zinfandel, it tastes like, you know, European. I was like, what's wrong with that? You know, and also things like I started doing, you know, what we know now as orange wines in 2005. To me, I made the idea up because within my own process, I didn't like white wines. And when I got white grapes, I just tried to make something heavier because I drank an amber ale versus a lager. And
Okay.
I was that was my reasoning. And then I guess, you know, 5 years later when I heard about orange wine, I was like, oh, okay, you know. And of course, the Georgian oranges are very different than what I do, but it's still skin contacted and, you know, tastes very different than California Chardonnay typically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or just super crisp.
Yeah.
Kind of white wine. Those first years, I guess, making, you know, natural wines, but before there was a term for it, you kind of alluded to it a little bit. The Zinfandel doesn't taste like some of the other Zinfandels, but I guess kind of like where did you find yourself in that era?
That's a great question because, you know, the divergence is in the using freeze-dried yeast or not, you know? Mm-hmm. And so with that divergence, then you're in a whole different category. And there's still even today, many wineries that aren't natural do native yeast ferments, you know? I mean, it's native plus, you know what I mean? Like, so they're adding sulfur at the crusher. They're killing a lot of the quote unquote bad bugs and then letting whatever native yeast survives that. You know, there's a secure process to it, and then adding whatever later because they can, especially if stuck fermentations are a thing. But for me, native yeast was the thing. And then after that, there's so many choices to make. You know, I mean, I had to do a lot of lab work for my master's degree, and I completely fell out of love with that because in all the numbers we processed, you know, it was a full-time work at the Viticulture and Enology Research Center at Fresno State. That's how I, you know, got through college, and seeing all these projects and all these numbers and analysis for statistical significance, I was like, but does it taste good? Like, where's the meaning in this?
Yeah.
You know, like, sure, okay, this is different. You can see something's got more color or whatever, but what the hell does it taste like? Like, does it even something I want to put in my mouth? You know, and I just fell strictly out of love with that whole thing and was like, I don't really want to use a lab, and kind of went Luddite on that. And I use a lab now for a little bit, you know. but I minimize those expenses, and I'm using my palate as the point I'm getting to be that device, a scientific device, organoleptic analysis of what I'm doing, both of the fruit and the day of pressing. So going beyond just native yeast or not native yeast, there's also what's the style, And
Yeah.
for me, I was doing classic wines. So I
Right.
still liked heavy tannins, big tannins. When natural wine came, when the wave came, it crashed right over me. I couldn't, there was no, people didn't want my wines, even though they were natural. And I didn't understand that. And then I had to learn about style and, glue, the whole, light and bright thing was what natural wine was to people. It wasn't anything else. And I was like, well, wait a minute, but that perspective, the ears weren't ready for that perspective. Now I think they are. We're talking about mostly a generational shift, right? I mean, this is mostly youngers, what I call youngers. That in the old schoolhouse situation, there was youngers and olders because all the students were together, not in separate classrooms in an institutional way, which is how most of us were done. But I think that term younger is great because I don't really want to refer to people as millennials or whatever, And so I just say youngers, maybe 20-somethings now. They were the ones, and maybe those are 30-somethings now, that started this trend. They just said, I want more integrity. It starts with that, right? And so that's why natural wine's here. It's not because of the, wine drinkers made a shift and said, I want, organic, like organic food. In the film Living Wine, I say, we're 25 years behind the organic food movement. And, that's where it's at. Like, this didn't come from consumers of the product looking to shift. It came from new consumers. There's another term I don't like, consumer, but it fits for now. But people that are using the product is another term I don't like. But anyway, just, tasting wine, taking wine, then, and deciding that they wanted something with more integrity, than what they could get, especially with the lack of transparency in the wine industry, complete lack. So then, there was I was interviewed for a newspaper article, and they were saying, when the film came out, it was a big deal here because this wasn't natural wine friendly. It's Sonoma County, North Coast. And the wine writer who was interviewing me, Peg Melnick, she'd written lots about conventional wines and with the lens against natural wine. And she wrote me an email and said, here's some things I'd like to discuss with you. And I'm like, oh, I'm in for it, Yeah. But when she showed up, she realized that a lot of it was stories that she'd been told that we could only fact check now. And one of them is, how do you know a wine's natural? And there's gatekeepers in that. And that's why I bring it up now that, the gatekeepers are the distributors. If I get caught as a, I hang my hat on natural wine. If I get caught, adding something to a wine or putting a wine out that's quote unquote not natural, that would upturn my whole market. I would lose 30 years of integrity and work that I'd done. So I don't do that. And when people that, had heard a lot of naysaying understand that, then they can see there are some checks and balances. It's not certifications, nothing like that necessarily for this, but they could see that then there is something for natural wine that makes it a thing that we can trust at some level. And then that in the end becomes a choice, just like organic versus non-organic food. And then, are we going to have to do a certification? Who knows? Those days are beyond us right now. But for now, it works as it is with this checks and balances. And for me, I was finding my way in what's integrity to me of the process. So how do I honor like the way I grow and do that in the winery, and then also bring something that's as reverential to the consumer as I can produce, whether someone's certifying that or not, and then have that story be the case. And so all of that, over these last 20 years has been wrapped up in the idea of what's natural wine style versus certification versus, a one-dimensional sort of flavor profile.
Yeah.
I think natural wine is just coming out of its infancy now.
Yeah, there's kind of like a style versus process type
Totally.
thing. And I think different generations think of it differently.
Yeah. And it makes sense. Like when your palate's new, if you're younger, you want something more fruit juicy, and then later it's like, I enjoy a thinking wine, I'll sit down with it and it's going to change.
Yeah.
30-day macerations are great for that. It doesn't have to be a big bruiser tannic thing, but it's not also glue, which is great if you're in a group of people and just, you're young and you're chugging it back, whatever you're doing, and you want to talk more and have fun, and thinking about the wines, and that's a whole different thing, but really that seemed to be the style of the whole natural wine. So I missed that wave when it came in. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about the moving back towards kind of your beginning for a second, but the farming. How was that coming along with your winemaking in the beginning? And I was just thinking, maybe I guess what you learned at school versus maybe what you learned on the home ranch, and with farming and even pruning methods or styles and vineyard management, kind of how you're like reconciling those maybe two different schools of thought. I guess it seems like they're different schools of thoughts based on your laugh.
Thank you. It's hilarious to think that I had no training in what I wanted to do, I just none. It was all just by guess and by golly, you're going to fail forward. And I certainly did that. I knew at an early age from high school that I just wasn't good at using pesticides. My uncle, I worked for him for a lot of years, Lee Martinelli, and he's a conventional farmer, and I just could not mix materials and spray them. I could see the contamination on my clothes, whatever, even if I had coveralls on. It wasn't, there's something inside me that was against it.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't be good at it, I guess. So, and we're also talking about like at school. So at Cal Poly in the early 90s, there's not even the term soil food web, which was Elaine Ingram that coined that term. We don't have that yet. That doesn't come out until the late 90s. So we're still really in the dark, actually, about what soil is. I mean, I remember my entomology, my insect class teacher. I said, hey, I thought I'd do something radical. I was like, hey, can I do something on biological controls? And her response was, I guess so. If you have to, if you feel you have to, that's fine. I'll accept it. There wasn't any support for it. And we're talking land grant schools get paid, by, companies that create products that farmers use. So you could see that may be baked in potentially. Mm-hmm. And so it was just always, the minute I started, that was my sort of bent, the way I leaned. And then when I got into grad school was for the first time that I actually enjoyed education.
Okay.
I went to Cal Poly because it was cool and a lot of beautiful girls there, and I felt like I could live, and I guess the education was sort of secondary. Yeah. But then in graduate school, I was like excited about it and juiced up and really focused. It was the first time in my life I actually found my focus, and so my graduate degree was in agricultural chemistry.
Okay.
But it was the focus was on winemaking, but they didn't have a whole lot of winemaking graduate level. So all my graduate level stuff was in chemistry and plant science. And it was there Mark Mays who had his run with pesticides as a teacher and died in his 40s, I believe, might have been early 50s. Oh. Of a cancer related to pesticide exposure.
Okay.
And he had realized, he'd had an epiphany, and we're talking mid 90s now. And he was a radical by saying, hey, you can do something on biological controls if you want. Everything I did with him and we met a lot. Everything was all biological centered. And that's where I learned about biodynamic farming. And, when I first called my buddy Paul Fry up in Redwood Valley, Mendocino, I was like, so what is, biodynamic farming? Is it running naked in the vineyard?
Yeah.
Which isn't horrible, but at the same time, what is it? And he laughed. And so I had to learn out of, ignorance of things and views and whatnot and teach myself. And there was the one teacher who allowed me to do that. But before that, it was really not supported. I didn't, it wasn't necessarily part of my work with the family, And so, my admin, Susan Ryan, calls me the green sheep of the family, and I have to laugh at that because I guess that's what it is. It's not how I set out to be. There was just something within me that I couldn't not do that. That's the only way I can explain it, because it makes no sense, really. It's not like I'm making money. It's not like, it worked in the sense of all the tests and all the science, because I do have a deep science background. So everything I do is observationally scientific. And I'm trying things like no irrigation plantings and all of these other things, and all the work that I do with soils, making a regenerative soil amendment. All of that came from what I'd learned anecdotally outside of school or with a place called Eco Farm. And then I just created these things for myself. So it was it was maybe a creative path, and I that's where my juices flow, is creativity. I've been pruning for 36 some odd years, whatever. And I created my own pruning technique. I call it bow cane. It's sort of a combination of things, but it's definitely using a cane and no wires. I don't really like wire trellises, And so all of that is just to say that I really don't know how to articulate it, other than there was just something there that wouldn't budge. It had to be. I had to have this biological focus and this integrity in my wines when that wasn't happening back then. And I don't, and here I am.
Yeah. I'd love to hear more about that bouquet pruning system if you'd like to say anything about it.
Well, so it started, I really enjoy pruning. It's probably I'm a weirdo. It's probably my favorite thing to do, actually.
Okay.
I mean, no, I don't enjoy doing cordons for acres and acres. No, nobody's enjoying that, right? You just do it if you have to. But I like the intersection of creativity and sculpture. I'm not doing it for sculpture, but that's also part of the game. And so the lens that I have in my mind when I'm pruning is as an organic farmer. So you prune differently than if you're a conventional farmer, right? Because conventional farmers, there's certain things they don't really have to pay attention to other than flavor-wise. So winemakers will tell them what they want, because even though they've never done it, they know the fruit they like tends to have this treatment. Let's say it's leaves pulled on one side from Sauvignon Blanc, for instance, which creates two different wines, if the leaves are pulled or not pulled, Sauvignon Blanc especially. For me, I don't really have the income to fulfill that need. Leaf pulling is one of the most expensive things you do on a farm. And so I was just like, let's just eliminate the need. And you can do that structurally. If you build the right structure, then you can eliminate some sprays and some cultural activities like leaf pulling. So fast forward, I had these big old vines that were quite tall, actually. I mean, they were 5 to 6 feet high in the permanent structure, and then that would grow up another couple feet. And I just realized as we were pruning, or as we were picking, I would have to go and pick the top part. Most people were a little shorter than that. And so that was sort of cumbersome. But then also in the teens, I think it was officially 14 through 16, what they called the first drought. We've come to find out that we've been in a drought since 2000, right? But this was the first real signs of a strong, negative rain, negative, perspiration in the air. It's not precipitation is the word I'm looking for, not perspiration. But we don't want to be there if the Earth's perspiring. But so So in those years, I had to cut those vines down, because what happens is on old vines, especially the old vines that I took over that my great grandfather planted in the 30s, they had some new typos. One of the reasons why I got, I tend to get vineyards that are decrepit and need to be resuscitated. That's an area of expertise that I have. So I, went in there and started making big cuts to get rid of the diseased woods called Eutypa lata. It's a vascular disease that is also called stunting disease or old vine decline. And you got to get rid of that stuff because it spreads fast. And farmers, that were relatives that had farmed this place, they didn't know that, So the first thing I'd go in is do sanitation, and then come these drought years, 14 through 16, and an old vine in that scenario, it'll kill itself. If it's got some stunting and then hits a drought and you've set too many buds at pruning, you can literally have it die back much further.
Okay.
And I saw that, and so I started making big cuts, and then I started to cut off these old arms that, an old arm from 85-year-old vines, it's beautiful. The permanent structure it's really gorgeous to look at. But if you look at those arms, you cut one off, you see that only a quarter of it's alive. Fully, the rest of that 75% is dead. And so that live part could be on the bottom of the arm or the top. And then you get problems with that connecting to the roots, see? And so, and if you get any trouble, that is easily killed. So if something happens, birds land and knock the shoots off, the whole arm can die because it doesn't have anything to continue its life with. And that can happen with drought as well. So I cut them down, meaning, from 6 feet, maybe half, not quite half, and just chose the best 3 arms. And then went through a first year where we definitely had a dip in tonnage from that treatment, but then also I was laying canes over, so that was picking it up a little bit.
Okay.
And then that just taught me to do an adapted thing where, if I've got 3 arms on a vine, I'm taking them over, and I had to put stakes at each vine now because I had canes that needed to tie to something. And that's where the bow cane comes in, because it's basically bowing over from an arm to a stake, and then it's tied there. And it's hard to explain on the radio, but if there's 3 or 4 canes, they're each in a different quadrant if you're looking down from above. And so what that does is it places the growth in different spots in the canopy, so you never get what we call a skirting effect, where it holds in the moisture. The wind can blow through.
Okay.
And that was really beautiful, especially for Zinfandel, which is really susceptible to harvest botrytis and whatnot. Aspergillus niger, which is sour rot. It really, can go get loaded with that stuff. And this really changed the game on a few vineyards that I farm. And it also makes better tasting fruit. The canes, fruit grown on cane, is more flavorful in my experience. Tend to be smaller berries. That UC Davis proved that you get smaller berries, then you have higher quality. We're definitely seeing that. Also can set a little more crop. So it depends where you place it and how many buds you want to put on it. So it's a hybrid system that then I brought to new vine plantings, which is a little tricky, a little more adaptable. I had to, instead of there being on a horizontal plane, I had to do it on a vertical plane because the vines haven't grown out enough yet.
Okay.
We got burned on that this year because that meant we had a lot of buds really down low in the way that it's trained for like a 2-year period. And the ripening was really uneven this year. A lot of struggling for sugar, and so I, had a lot of crop from below that was underripe, and we just continued to pick it. I was multitasking that day, and I wasn't paying enough attention to the fruit. I looked at it and I was like, it sure looks green. Well, I should have stopped everything right then. So it's farming. There's always fails, and that was, but that system works great. Like it had set more crop than, it was shocking. We were picking 1.5 trays per vine. I'm not afraid of that because I know that the flavors are in balance. I'm no-till. There's no tillage, so we're not, pumping a vine up with water. Nor are we, and also there's a companion planting effect there and a stress with with a certain amount of surface level plants. So that has kept the flavors, amazingly well, and especially on the Zin, which really produces. It's where we love it. I make a rosé with it. I do a red with it, and it's great. I wouldn't ever want to, trim crop off. I don't need to.
Mm-hmm. You said you talked to Paul kind of as you're starting farming and asking about biodynamic practices and things like that. Were those things that you were incorporating in the vineyard from the beginning? It seems like at least now soil health is sort of a super important thing for you.
Well, I mean, and that gets a little bit more into the story, I suppose. So, I graduated in 97 and 98. I took a job 50-50 winemaking and vineyard work. No one was offering that. I just sort of created that job at this place. I interviewed a lot of places. People were like, yeah, we don't have both crews, or our crew doesn't go both ways. Now that's different. Some wineries do that. But I found one where they're like, well, we'd love to have you be our assistant and also be the assistant winemaker and assistant vineyard manager. And so I was like, okay, I'm cool with that. And then, my boss got a DUI and like his fourth one. And the owner called me in and said he can't drive equipment anymore, for us. Nothing, insurance cut him off. And he's like, we need you to manage it. And I was like, well, this is like 4 months into the job. Yeah. And I was like, well, that wasn't our agreement. But if I can start my label here, so I just used it as a negotiation point, and that's when I started the label. But I subsidized it for about 7 years with a day job, being a vineyard manager. I had to give up the assistant winemaking there, but I still had a heavy hand in the way things were done there, especially the engineering of it. But so at that time, they were conventional vineyard. I was like, but I'd also want to do it organically. So if you want me, that's the way it's going to be. And they were like, well, okay, we want that too because we live here. There were actually 4 vineyards, all, that was one of them. There were 3 others off site.
Okay.
And so I hired a consultant to teach me to do biodynamics. That was 1998. Big year for me. I started being a biodynamic farmer, started my own natural winery. And I remember going to a biodynamic farmer meeting like in 2000, 2001. Sonoma County, it was just a bunch of just us weirdos.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to 2010 when Napa had a meeting, and, Napa had been picking this up. Places like, am I even going to think of them? Real high-end wineries were picking this up. And I was shocked. I went in there, it was in a huge room, standing room only, 200 people plus, and a lot of high dollar wineries and people. And I was like, oh, okay, they know that the flavors are better. They don't care about the woo-woo, we don't need to know how this happens, but just we know the flavors are better, so just do that.
Yeah.
And I had, those of us that have done biodynamics see how the flavors really change, and it's for the better, and that's a beautiful thing. I mean, and it just makes sense, right? If you're terroir focused, meaning taste of the place, that's the term I prefer to use, taste of the place, then making a plant more sensitive to its environment, more in tune, and potentially more stressed with what's happening there, then the flavors just increase. And biodynamics definitely helps with the sensitivity to the site in a plant. And it's also woo-woo. It's a lot of people want me to explain things, and it's tricky because it's hard for people to believe, but. We had a problem with one of my guys that was spraying the 501, which is called horn silica. He got a rash from his body, and that was at the beginning. So you can imagine this young guy out of grad school taking over this conventional farm, converting it to biodynamics, and my crew was like, I had a crew of 15 guys. They're like, where's the suits, the Tyvek suits, and where's the toxic shit? This doesn't work. Like what you're doing has no input. And then, it was like that for a couple of years actually. Okay. And poor Eligio, had to suffer being my backup driver on the morning sprays for horn silica. And he had I'll shorten the story. He ended up having an allergy to silica. He had to quit. He had to quit insulation construction work because he just touching the insulation, he would just get rashes on his arms.
Oh, wow.
Well, the day that I had him spray this stuff, I got we mix it at midnight, and it's a morning spray, and I get a call at like 8 a.m. I'd been home for a couple hours taking a nap, and it was the ag commissioner. If someone goes to the hospital and they say, I was spraying and they're sick, you're going to get a call from the ag commissioner. And it's not a fun call.
Right.
And he's like, I'm going to meet you in 2 hours. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
And he was like, what is this stuff? And so you can imagine I'm trying to explain, burying, grinding up silica, burying it in a horn over the summer solstice. And he's glazing over and he's just getting madder. And he's like, I don't get it. What does it do? And I was like, well, it's a plant positive approach. It's not a pesticide. We're not killing anything. And I thought that was my winning card. And he just got madder because now he couldn't get me, necessarily. So he goes, well, then if that's true, then why did it do that? Which is a really good point.
Yeah.
And that was when I asked, Eligio if he had ever have to leave a job. And that was just sort of divine inspiration. I don't know why. That was a weird question to ask. And he said he had to leave a job. And I said, what was it? And he said it was insulation. I got a rash on my arms. And I was like, there it is. Like this stuff is highly potentized. And so he had a literal rash from his elbows to his knees, his whole torso. It was so uncomfortable just to look at him, let alone him having to live it. He was off for like 2 weeks. It was that bad. And after that day, this crew, they listened to everything. They're like, okay, we get it. It works. And made me a believer too, to be quite honest, because you're using homeopathic doses of this stuff. It's like, come on, can it really have the level of energy that, Rudolf Steiner told the people it would in 1924? You never know. I see the difference. I can see the difference in the growth, and especially in the petioles of the leaves. Mm-hmm. They become more erect, 45-degree angle. So there's observations that are clear. But Eligio had to suffer for everybody to realize and recognize, like, wow, there's a lot of, and we're not even, it's just, we're fogging it. It's not even, it doesn't have to get on the leaves. It just sort of fog it. And I stir it and mix it, and I don't wear, any protective clothing. We didn't have anything, for the driver, and he doesn't get wet by it, but he's just exposed to it. And so that's my big comeuppance, moment. In biodynamics, and I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, intense story, and that it's probably uncomfortable. A few hours.
That day was bad. Yeah. But once I got out of it, and I'll never forget the ag commissioner. He was so mad at this point because he still didn't know what to do. Right? Like theoretically, I should get a ticket because somebody got hurt. So that means that the material wasn't used in its proper fashion. That's the lens which the ag commissioner uses for farming. Especially if you get, if it's on paper, somebody went to the hospital and got hurt, there needs to be a trail beyond that. And he was so mad, he just got up and he said, damn it, if this happens again, I'm coming back here and I'm giving you an $1,100 fine. I don't care what it is. And just walked out the door. And I was like, well, thank you. God, I got it through that one,
Yeah.
So needless to say, Eligio didn't do any more spraying for me.
Okay. Yeah. Besides the Zinfandel, what were the wines that you were making at that time for Old World? What else were you starting out with?
That's hilarious. I grew up drinking my grandfather's, as I mentioned, big Zinfandel. So that's what I was trying to make.
Yeah.
But the only grapes I could get were Pinot Noir.
Okay.
and so I was like, oh, what the hell? I'll just make it with this. My cousin Lee Martinelli Jr. was growing it, and we did a deal, and I started making wines from his grapes in school. Mm. And then when I came back, his were the main 2 vineyards that I was using for Pinot. And I came to just love Pinot, the nuance, it shows a barrel really nicely. Back then I was into new oak, not super new, but new oak. I still, I still have a penchant for that, you know, especially on Chardonnay. I love a little bit of oak on Chardonnay. I'm not, I don't want it to coat my mouth. I don't want to feel like I'm eating a piece of ham. But at the same time, it's a nice nuance that is really eschewed in natural wine, And I eschew it in my budget. So I'm happy with the, the neutral barrels that I have, and what I do is really doesn't need that kind of oak anyway in the orange wines. It's so much more interesting in just seeing it for what it is. But and so coming back to Pinot, I loved those wines. They were big, massive wines. This is before the Parkerization of the wine universe. And I did that for probably 10 years. And then I started to see the changes. There was a winery who I'd better not state who they were. One of the vineyards that I was farming for my day job was in the middle of this other big winery, in Sonoma County Winery. And their vineyard crew, we were 10 acres in the middle of a 120 acre vineyard. Mm. And it was, the owner that I worked for had sold the other part, right? So he kept one part. That's why it was a really interesting, weird dynamic there.
Right. Sounds like.
But Javier was the manager of that vineyard, and we were picking, and I was like, dude, these, our Syrah is at like 27. It's massive. Like we even feel like we missed the bit on. You guys haven't even started picking, and it's going to be, it takes you guys weeks to pick 100 acres. Like, what are you doing? And he goes, the winemaker called me and said, we're not going to start picking until 27.
Wow.
Just made that drastic decision in 1 year. The prior, they'd start at 23.5, whatever. This time they're starting at 20. So they're getting to be desiccated and 29-ish.
Yeah.
So you have to water that. There's just so many things you have to do for stuff like that, which has become the style of some cult wineries in California.
Yeah.
And I, just saw that, and I was like, I'm changing my style like that. I don't want to be associated with that. Like, this is going to be a huge thing, all this alcohol. And so that was my first adjustment. I brought that back, started playing with some other treatments on the skins as well, more limited maceration times, and found a sweet spot that I really like with the bloom wine. That's kind of that one's 5-day macerations, but skins and stems, so 100% stems in.
Yeah,
I like a little bit of that savory component. So just the ever flowing, adjusting artistic process.
Would you say overall in the last 25 years, almost 30 years, is that kind of the style that your winemaking has gone? Shorter macerations, picked a little earlier?
Very interesting comment there, because yes and no, right? So like that became a big product for me. Number one's our Laureate, which is a Chardonnay based orange wine. Number two is Bloom, which is the 5-day maceration. So definitely a big deal for how the market received it. And then I started, I'd been doing, so resolving tannins is a thing, right? So that's a term that a winemaker should be thinking about. And most natural winemakers aren't extracting enough tannins to have to resolve them. And also you need to do that if you're a young, hip, fresh winery that doesn't have a lot of time or money to hold on to hold back wine. Well, I was making big tannic wines and then learning that, oh shit, I have to sit on this for 5 to 10 years, and people aren't coming to me looking for Barolo, you know what I mean? So it ends up being a bad business decision. And so I was looking for ways to resolve the tannins other than in bottle, but I still wanted to include tannin because that ageability, that product is very different. To me, drinking a 10-year-old wine is the experience I want to have. And even though I've made some great rosés that are just fantastic in 10 years, but the bigger reds, as they lean back out, show you a different thing, a unique thing. You just can't factor what it's going to be. It just becomes that, right? So I decided to start doing extended macerations, because that does heal a lot of those wounds. So we can do in 30 days what was taking me 5 years in bottle. It's more risky. Definitely along the way, I dumped some tons of fruit, and then sort of perfected the process. And so I have that now in its own wine. It's called Ecstatic Consciousness. That's where my palate is. So it's 30-day macerated with all the stems in too, which takes it to another level of intensity that works backward a little bit. And so you get this thing it's more drinkable sooner than the 5 to 10 year thing. And so that is probably the one thing that doesn't, that everything else is lighter maceration. This one's extra macerated, but then to make it a little bit lighter. And it's a whole different drinking process. It's the ultimate complexity is that wine.
Yeah. I noticed you said like stems included. Is that a whole cluster fermentation, or are you destemming, adding stems back in, or you want some of the whole berries?
Yeah, it's
there,
a great comment, because I used to destem and add stems back, about at a 20% to mimic whole cluster 20%. Whenever you say whole cluster, it's so confusing now in natural wine, because whole cluster typically in natural wine means carbonic maceration, which isn't a friend of my palate. My palate doesn't like it, so I don't do it. I like a little bit of it, whole berries in the mix, sure, but all of it's in solution. So I don't have stems like packed in a bin without a lot of juice that has to have carbon dioxide to keep it going. So you get those bubblegum kind of flavors, that lightness, which is really pretty, especially in the color. Really makes a really pretty color. This is 100% stems in, fully crushed, soaked, and just over. Like in 2 weeks, it's undrinkable. Like during the 2 week maceration is ridiculous. It's ruined basically. And then in the next 2 weeks, it starts to work itself backwards. The tannins are long. Let's call them 25, 26 carbon chain compounds, and just like a baking chocolate. It's long carbon chain tannins, phenols without sugar taste horrible. And so chocolate isn't the same thing when it's before it's been sugared and or blended. And this is the same thing, but because it's in solution, those compounds can fall out. And so they come together, this 25, 26 chain carbons, they're active and they'll grab each other. And when they do that, they're too heavy to stay in solution, falls out. And so we can rack off of those. And at pressing, where we actually lose a lot of the really insulting bitter tannins, and we're left with something that can be still a little bit insulting, but barrel heals some of those wounds. And then the blend of varietals will come together so that decides how drinkable it's going to be and when. And it's we've only released the first one of it, and we've got 2 more, and so that's the best wine to be maybe 3 years. 3 years. That's what we're looking at right now.
I'd love to hear a little about my pronunciation of it is always kind of incorrect, or but Arboreaux or early Burgundy, which is easier for me to say, because I've only had ever one other one in California that was a varietal wine, and that was a while back. I don't think that vineyard is there anymore. It seems like you have maybe the only stand out there of Arboreaux, if that's the way you pronounce it.
Yeah, Arboreaux. Yeah, Arboreaux. It's a Basque variety, and believed to be, according to Andy Waterhouse, there isn't any surviving. He was a professor at Davis. There aren't. He was a professional ampelographer. And he was one that we paid money to come and double check this place. And he said, there isn't any vineyards of this anymore. It does exist in field blends, a lot of field blends. And so a lot of varietal wines that were made in the past were typically a harvest of that variety in a field blend. But growing a whole vineyard side by side, apparently this is the last one in California. And, it has a storied history. It came here in the 1800s. My great-grandfather planted it in the 1890s, along with a bunch of other varieties, Muscadel, Trousseau Gris, Palomino, Mondouse Noir, and actually Zin. And from that little block, which still exists today, the same vines, they decided that Arboreaux and Zin were the 2 varieties that they would plant the rest of the ranch with. And they didn't have a whole lot of planting ground, maybe 30 acres total out of, 500 could be vineyard. And so they went with those 2 varieties, and they ended up grafting over the Arboreaux, except for this one spot that a second cousin came to own, and they just held on to it, just out of respect for the old vines, forget about the variety. So that's how I found it when it needed, a new farmer, and I was invited in, and I took it over in '08. So that's been a minute, ago. And that was, like I mentioned earlier, had to really resuscitate those vines. But, there's no story as to how or why these varieties came. It was whoever, the merchant that got in the middle of those transactions in Europe that decided these varieties are what came on the boat. They went to New York, and the story that we have, and it's hard to even know what's true, but the story that seems most likely is ships were leaving San Francisco with tallow, because tallow was really important, right? It was candles back then. It still wasn't electricity, and so a lot of whale blubber and a lot of beef tallow were how you saw to read, and maybe some kerosene, had been developed. And so the tallow was really important. They would take it down to Panama and then unload it, and it had to go train, because there's no Panama Canal, train over to the next boat, and that would take it up to New York. And so there's a back haul on that system, right? So the main haul was the tallow. And so when the ships were heading back to Panama, they just threw, all these nursery items in there. So these varietals got thrown in along with whatever else, persimmon trees, quince, whatever the settlers, wanted at that time, or what they thought the settlers would want.
Yeah.
And that's basically what you had to choose from. Fast forward to my great-grandfather's, like, I got a ranch, what am I going to pour? Or what am I going to plant? And it's like, I'll just take one of everything and then co-plant them. And if any, and they randomized it. And I think the way they did that was they cut the buds off of the budding sticks.
Okay.
Because they're grafting. In many cases, they used, at that time, there was St. George rootstock, and there was also some own root. But they would, plant something, because in that day, a rootstock could fight with the weeds better, and then you graft it in 3 years. And so then they get the budding, and they had to have mixed the buds in a bucket to randomize it like this. I don't see how you could do it otherwise. It's just interesting how they did this. Yeah. And they were worried that, if one variety was susceptible to powdery mildew, then it spread fast, which it does. So that was wise. And so that's the best that we can understand of why they did these things. And then use that as their experiment, their scientific experiment in observation, and then move forward with the other varieties. Yeah, so Abouriou came that way. It's a heavy-bodied red blending wine. I could see why it would have been sent here because of the way it's used in Europe still, which there's very few plantings of it, but it still will beef up the Bordeaux wines when there's a bad season, and that's apparently on the down low. It's not necessarily a legal thing to do, but that's where one of the areas that it survives significantly.
Okay. Yeah, I've read some of those firsthand account. Well, San Francisco, there used to be whaling ports, San Francisco and Oakland, and I've read some of those firsthand accounts of the nurseries sending folks across the Isthmus of Panama back up to San Francisco and San Jose. I mean, yeah, people are dying on that trip to bring, like you said, persimmon trees or some grape sticks or fig, whatever people order. I think the one I read was for Stockton, where it was where they were going.
Oh wow!
Wow! But
yeah,
so interesting accounts.
Yeah, and there's just so much history there. There's a book called the Basque History of the World. I don't know if you've heard of it. I just I make a Basque cider and I have this Basque variety of Abouriou, and Basque just kept coming into my life, and it wasn't a choice. I just made this cider, and it turns out it's like a Basque cider. And so I was like, what? I'm curious about this. And somebody recommended that book. And so I picked it up, and, it was shocking to me how this really small country, these Basque people, were at the center of a lot of what we call European history. I mean, a lot of it. And most likely one or all of the ships that were, given to be the ones that discovered the our North American continent. But that's most likely, not exactly the whole truth, right? And so it was because the Basque people had built those, or one or all of them. They can't prove exactly, but they were the best seafaring people at the time, and that came from them following the whales.
Okay.
And so they were heading north, and they believed that both they and the Vikings actually probably saw North America first. And for them, it was because they followed the whales down. They were strict about never telling anybody where they were getting the whales. You know, and reading that, it just puts so much together in that. There's so much we don't know about this country.
Yeah, like cod fishing was big with them.
Yeah.
Also, which
salted cod.
Yeah.
There's a whole chapter on that, and they that was also part of that route. So their route, they had to go north because that fishery gave up, right? They'd fished it out.
Okay.
It was started out with the fishery that they had, on their own shore, and then they would travel north and just follow that, I guess, to Iceland, Greenland, and then to North America. Most likely is what I guess they've proven Vikings arrival, but I don't think they've proven artifacts from the Basque. But most likely, they make a good case for it in the book anyway.
Yeah, interesting. What was the idea behind the cider, or was it just in Sonoma here, kind of the heritage of apples, or?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I feel that cider and maybe apples in general are really the forgotten history of America, what we call America. And, apples went to every state. There's the whole Johnny Appleseed story, right? And there's just all of this lore, and there's so many varieties. And literally, you can grow apples in any state. Why is not apple wine our number one beverage? That really, fathoms me, especially because it's low alcohol, 7% alcohol. That's low compared to wine, and maybe high to beer. But apples, they don't get smoke taint. They survive most seasons. Their biggest vulnerability is the blossoms during the spring. You get through that, you're gonna get crop that you can make into cider. Even though they alternate bear, but you can play with varieties, and some are the orchard that I farm. There's always some apples that are doing better than others every year. So all of this history. Well, fast forward to from the origins to maybe 25, 30, 40 years ago. Well, I guess apples started here probably in the 1950s, somewhere in there, in a succession after hops, which was earlier. And then there's hops, prunes, and apples were the three kind of things that kind of cycled. But hops couldn't come back at a certain point. They died out by a fungi. A fungus got them. So apples really got a stronghold in Sebastopol. Something about that cool, wet climate there just made a really crisp, beautiful apple. The Gravenstein in particular became the one that was the sort of the poster child for that industry that really struggled over over starting 25 years ago. Washington started to build its industry pretty much on a monoculture, of red apples mainly, and they could do it all so much cheaper. So Sebastopol's apple growing ground started giving way, and things started getting converted over to vineyards, and the canneries got closed. They got purchased by Treetop, and I used to haul apples there in high school.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I remember the year that that my uncle, he was planning to sell, haul his apples in, and the salesperson went out there, and in June, they closed escrow like that spring. In June they went out, and in July is when they start delivering apples. They said, we're not taking any of your crop.
Wow.
And they told and this is a guy who was the salesperson for 40 years. He was crying, it was his job to do that. And then the whole thing, they just shut the whole thing down. That's what, anti-competition, Treetop did that. And so we started to really lose the last sort of foothold on all that heritage. And orchards were converting in, fast forward to 2013, a friend of mine wanted me to make his cider. And so I, at first he asked me in 2012 and I turned him down. I was like, I don't know anything about cider. I don't know how to make cider. Like, it was really ignorant for me to say that. And I was like, no, I can't do it. And he had a bad experience elsewhere, and he came back and wrote me a check and said, you're making my cider. And that was the way to convert
Like,
me,
well, okay.
And then I just had this, oh my God moment. I'm like, what was I afraid of? This is just, it's no different. It's just different equipment. And then I do some engineering, and I created an adaptive part for a destemmer to make it an apple crusher.
Okay. Nice.
Using about 32 stainless steel knives. Looks like a torture device from the medieval era, but it works beautifully. Because using winemaking equipment as it is for apples is a beautiful thing to do. I don't really want to use bags, plastic bags to basically hold it in the press.
Yeah.
From something that makes pulp. To use basically a pump. So I wasn't into that, and so I changed it, and it worked. So I enjoy making cider. It's been really hard. People don't want to. It doesn't work in the wine channels. Hipsters, and connoisseurs, they don't really want cider. They want wine. Their wine lights them up. It's hard to go from wine to cider. People tend to go from beer to cider, right? So it tends to be, the whole gluten-free kind of thing is what's brought cider drinkers in. But cider, the way it sells best is really cheaply, and now in limited, in cans, whatever, and so, as far as bottling a nice cider, it's kind of an aardvark, as my boss used to say. It's something that's, people don't necessarily want. There are those that want it. You have to work hard, to be in that. I make one or two ciders, I'm still doing it. They're barrel aged. It does blur the line between what's vinous and what's cidery, so like it does tend to have more, I like it as a still wine. That's a real aardvark. No one really wants to buy that. So, but why not? Why can't we have a white wine that's apple based, that's still, that you can sip with your dinner? Sure, bubbly beverage, that's great. It's more of a beginning, I don't necessarily always want bubbly with my food. You know what I mean? I want a still wine. And so I find that a lees aged, barrel aged cider is quite nice, and it has a whole lot more complexity than people expect, but still the market's not ready for that product. I'm always, too far ahead.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of pull back on that. So cider was originally for me about saving these old trees. Then that orchards got converted, and I had found another orchard that I'm farming today. And, it's an effort, and how little can I do, because there's just no money in it, which is, sad, but that's just what it is. I can't go broke farming it, so I have to be careful. So I do, right now, the minimal I can until I can find a live channel, that works for cider. I mean, it seems to work better in the Midwest than here, but it's still, I have to sell it way lower pricing, so I don't really get the value for the handwork that we do. It's just sort of like a way to keep it going, and stay flat with it. I mean, flat's the new, the new success, So it's, I will take that over a loss, I'll take staying flat, but it's not, there's no sustainability in that, so I got to figure out what it's going to be.
Yeah, and I guess for that serious style of cider, maybe it's something that doesn't fly off the shelves quite as easily as something kind of a little sweet and, and bubbly and
totally
like more apple juicy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Singularity in flavor. To me, it just coats my mouth. I can only drink so much of that, but the the bubbles and the sweetness just feels nice. People need that. It's not my thing. So I do a crisp, dry cider, and you can tell cider lovers would be like, oh, it's dry. It's like, okay, well, here we go. But that's just what it is. I mean, it's funny in the wine world, people speak dry, typically drink sweet, right? But they really want a dry, sparkling, quote unquote serious, wine people. And so if you bring that lens to cider, it seems like it's much harder.
Mm-hmm.
And and cider's the whole thing about it is just messed up. It's a really fraught with issues. The term. I mean, you got the history of the powers that be. Before the Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, there was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and whatever was before that, definitely had some of industry, connections, if you will. And so it was made for sure that cider would always be a secondary beverage. It could not have the same lens that wine has. You can't vintage date it legally. There's so many laws about what you can put on the label, and those just work against its elevation. It's an uphill battle to try to elevate it, so it's kind of, that's baked in too, to keep it as a second. And I'm just waiting for that to rise, because I think if there's, natural wine's sort of about the resistance, the it's about not just resistance, but like how to create something new, that people want. I think cider really works, with that. And that term maybe has to go, because it's so, like hard cider, I think it's a difficult term. That's just weird to call it that. And then also, cider means juice to some people. Sometimes it's mulled spice things. People, it's just been used so much that we probably have to go away from it and just accept apple wine, which is legally how you can't just call it wine. It has to be apple wine, right?
Okay.
So, because wine is by law reserved for vinous, for grape beverages, and so apple can't be that, which is interesting. So it's got an uphill battle.
Yeah. How long do you barrel age it for?
Well, so what I was doing was col fondo.
Okay.
Which is the method of making, Prosecco, a low alcohol, Italian sparkling wine. And I was taught by Ernesto Cattell, who had Costa Dia. He died, unfortunately, early in life. And I've carried on because I love the process, but it's also never a perfect process. It's natural. So we're making a base wine, and I age it Sur Lee for a year. And all that's doing is getting you to the next vintage, which 200 years ago, you couldn't keep juice year round. There wasn't necessarily, sugar easily to add to it, whatever. And so you just wait until the following season, you got fresh juice again, inoculate it with fresh juice, maybe something that's slightly fermenting, stick it in bottle. It re-ferments in bottle.
Yeah.
Then you've got a sparkling beverage that's non-disgorged, so it has solids in it, but it's not as much solids as the other processes. And that was the way I was making it, so aging it a year. Now I've got cider in barrel for about 3 years, and that's what started to, because I just was like, I'm going to take a break from bottling cider, but I didn't necessarily take a break from producing it. I would just produce a small amount. And I was like, I love this. Maybe I just do a Solera blend, mix barrels, bottle as a still. I couldn't get traction in the wine market for that. So I don't know what I'm doing. I probably have to make it sparkle. But it has so much mouthfeel. It has so much intrigue and complexity and, and acidity. It's definitely the opposite of a boring cider. It's not quite to the Basque cider level, which I do that too. Done a couple of them, and, there's people that just love that, but for the rest of my industry, they're just completely afraid of it. It's a spoiled wine to them. You know what I mean? Yeah. But it has its value. It's like lime zest. I pick them underripe to be even more higher acid, so you get these limey qualities. But now when I pick the apples, I like them a little bit riper.
Okay. I'd love to ask you just about sort of food, cooking, health. You seem like you live like a very kind of like Zen spiritual kind of existence here with the property. I mean, we ate a lunch of everything grown here. Persimmons drying off to the side. I guess I don't know that I have a question, maybe, but. Yeah. Do you have any comment on
of course.
on that?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting that. It's the least discussed of of things. What do you do? How do you? I would phrase that like, how do you feed your inner self? Because winemaking just doesn't do it, right? Like it's a thing that I do. I'm a technician. It's a trade, that I'm associated with, and I think that I viewed it more highly. Maybe some people see wine as the ultimate thing, and I had to pull myself out of that dynamic where, sure, wine's great and it's important, but there's higher things. I had to find what meant something to me on the inside. I grew up Roman Catholic, went to school taught by nuns. Certainly my kids weren't going to do that. Not into it at all. Never was after I left those schools. But I, for about 15 years, I do meditation and study Eastern religions. And I have a teacher, and it's an active thing for me every week. I'm doing something for that. And it's really important to me. I don't know, it's impossible to live a Zen life, because life on this planet is, as I always jokingly say, we're not on the angel planet, we're on the lesson planet. We're here to learn. And that means there's pain coming whether, whatever you try to do. So, my view was get myself as stable on the inside as I could, so I could handle those moments that I'm not looking for, that I don't want, but they're coming, because that's what life here is.
Yeah.
And so there's so many routes for different people on that. For me, meditation is the way to find yourself, actually. And so then I also had a health crash in 2020. Had a lifetime of too many antibiotics, that kind of thing. I was allergic to a lot of things as a kid, and my gut never really developed, and had all these problems over, in my youth that I could ignore.
Yeah.
Not that that's a good idea. So then I finally just decided, no, I didn't decide anything. It decided for me. I went down in 2020. I was sick. I just, I felt like I was getting dementia. I couldn't remember anything, losing train of thought. Still have issues with that. And come from toxin buildup, leaky gut builds up toxins. There's just so much about when your gut's off, you are off. And it could be said, and it has been said, that, dementia, these kinds of things, toxins and gut problems lead more aptly to that. And I got really scared that I was getting that, actually, frankly. And so I had to just change everything. I've always had a penchant. I look at winemaking as one thing. I look at it as post-harvest handling. It's about the farming process. And then how do you create from this thing that you worked so hard for the whole season, how do you create a durable good out of it? That's, to me, what wine is. Sure, I fell in love with it, honored it, held it as reverential. I pull back a little from that today, because alcohol is also a nerve toxin, and you have to be careful with, how much you're taking in, especially if your system is degraded, and you have issues. It goes worse. I lived that. So I had to check that. America's maybe doing that in its own way now. There's just, people have gone teetotal, quit drinking. I never could do that because I'm still a winemaker, but I had to really limit my consumption. Today I still do, but I'll enjoy it on occasion, especially when I'm out in the market. So I had to learn how to rebuild myself from within. That's not an easy path. You don't just go to the doctor to find out about that. I've been doing a lot of reading since, for a lot of years. I mean, because I've had health issues, since early on. And I just brought it all to a culmination and found a good alternative, what we call alternative, what Europeans call complementary. Very interesting how we changed the word, complementary. We call it alternative. But same thing. And got myself on a path of healing, detoxing. I have to stay active, so I have a number of different things that I use to help me through that, supplements. And then my farming. I just brought my farming technique to my food, which, I found with Paul Kaiser from Singing Frog Farm in Sebastopol. Met him, heard his talks a few times, and I was like, what is the matter with me? I make all this soil amendment, and I'm just using it for wine. Like I'm not growing food with it, which is the most the highest nutrient density food is grown with good soil using microbes and the carbon cycle. So I brought that to my food, and I learned early on. I've been doing this for I guess a little over a dozen years, and I learned that I don't want to grow lettuces. Raw food isn't that great for what my system's going through. Also, those are here and gone. What I want to grow is durable goods. And again, back to post-harvest handling, you notice the persimmons. I can make a durable good out of those. Hoshigaki, dried. It's a gelled kind of substance. It's really good. Doesn't take any, I don't have to do anything fancy to it or add anything. So, I settled on growing perennial beans, as a eating the seed, not as a green bean, as we would call baked beans, that kind of thing. And then growing Mohawk red corn that was shared with me from a tribe, and squash. Those are my big three. I eat a lot of those in my diet. Squash, most people have never seen a squash. I think they call it winter squash. But most people have never seen a ripe squash. What we eat is underripe zucchini, which is great. It's yummy. But when I let them get big, and in that case, there's more sugars built in. They're not sweet, but there's way more nutrient density in it, especially when the roots are deep in good soil. And they last on my porch, stored on gratings, so they have to breathe. You can't store it on a flat spot for a year and a half to 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, squash most people don't know squash. People get a plastic coating. It's the first plastic on Earth. and we know this about gourds, right? Yeah. Indigenous people use them for water jugs. They just there's something about the skin does something, but on these is a little different than the water gourds. These squash get a plasticized coating. You have to use a cleaver to break through it.
Okay.
And after 2 years, the seeds on the inside start sprouting, and they get a really peppery taste. They're quite good, actually. Yeah, and so that's usually my window. I want to eat it, by then. I don't, they don't usually last that long because, last year was a really bad year for squash. My gophers ate a lot of squash. I didn't get to eat as much. You know what I mean? But this year
everybody's got to eat.
This year was great. So we've kind of fixed the gopher problem, and so for me, it's about wholeness. How am I whole? Mind, spirit, body. It takes all of it. Physical. I've got to be doing something that's greater than me to keep me in my humility, so that I don't dive into my arrogance. It's so easy to do, especially when you know things. And like when they, gave me a master's degree, when I walked off that stage, I thought I knew something, and it took me years to work that back. It was just like fed my arrogance. So it's even taken a long time now to pull that out of me and to understand my humility, understand there's something greater than me, and whatever you want to call it can be the view, I guess I call it God. Some people call it goddess, creator. I look at it all as the same thing. And there's every culture has a name for it, right? And wars are fought over that name, saying mine's better than yours. To me, it's the same thing. And so that's the way I've found that I can accept what I do, who I am, and be in this role that is just to be here and, maybe tell people my experiences, and hopefully that does some good when I pass on. That's what'll be left. And the experiences, what people may know from that. And, I'm not looking to check out anytime soon, but it's the way I view things now. I'm holding the space for what's next, because I don't know that I'll ever get to live the idyllic dream, whatever it is.
Okay.
So I look at it as we're all holding a space for the next person that, wants to learn something and try again for that, whatever that idyllic space, that whatever that is to them. I think that's all about what seekers, that term for people that want something better, that can envision something better. It's a difficult space to be in when you can envision it and it's not here, and you want to live it. And that can be frustrating through life, right? And so we got to create the change we need, which is what I feel like I did, in '98 when I started this thing, and then and just hope that we can survive in the meantime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Feels kind of like your whole life's been leading to that, as you told me the story of it, or at least the last 30 years or
Yeah.
so.
I mean, maybe the whole thing
Maybe
is,
the whole thing.
I think you stated the wisdom right there. And I guess I'm grateful that I could have the lens to see it, that I could see it and understand what it was. Cause otherwise I would just be a frustrated person, cause there's so much that doesn't work, and you have to, especially for me, I'm an engineer minded person. I want to make it right. And sort of, as one of the old Ronco products said, set it and forget it,
Right.
right? The the view of Descartes, that philosopher that said that the universe is a machine. I bought that story, man, and like, I wanted to build it, and if you build it, they will come, that whole thing. And it's just that's not where it's at. It's gratitude for what you have, that there's things already here that we don't necessarily understand. We don't know what they are, but if you really think about it, nothing should work. How difficult, right? But things do. People call it synergy. They call it luck, providence. I call it spirit, God, whatever. It's like there's something there that helps you in those moments that are absolute. That something is needed to help, and I've had that all along. And even though it doesn't look like the view of success that my ego fed me in my 20s, the fact that I'm here and can speak from a place of experience and wisdom, that's what I value. Yeah.
You do have like very engineering oriented mind. It seems like it's not scientific, but yeah, it all comes together.
And there was that inner fight, both they don't coexist well unless you understand yourself, So there were so many times where I'm just at war inside myself with either that engineering mind or that spiritual mind, or how come it's not all this? How come it's not all that? I can engineer it. How come it doesn't work then? It works, but it doesn't work totally, So then there's a comeuppance there, is an old term, meaning, in the end, there's a pinnacle, that there's a lesson in it, and not attending the lesson is where the frustration is. And I had to start paying attention to the lessons, not let my arrogance tell me that didn't happen like it should. There's what I would call entitlement in that,
Okay.
And so that's not where it's at. It's not how the universe works. Animals, they're not entitled to food. They got to go out and catch something, or they starve. I mean, my cats, I feed them, so they're alive. They still got to catch stuff, and they want to. But if they were in the wild, it would be a much shorter lifespan.
Yeah.
Entitlement's not really a thing. It's a construct in our own minds, and just comes from, the way our upbringing. And, it's one thing to work out along with arrogance. And so to me, I guess the beauty of a situation like this, like I've created and been doing for 30 years, it's taught me a lot of those lessons, where I think that if I was, maybe economically successful and had more money in the bank, I wouldn't have known. That maybe for me is the thing I value the most, even though there are days where I'm like, how come I couldn't bank some more money? Where is that? Was that coming? But at the same time, I guess what I had to reckon was that what I value most isn't necessarily that.
Yeah.
And so I was operating from two opposing places. And so that's the inner turmoil that I always felt,
Yeah. And, natural wine might not be the biggest moneymaker in the world.
I mean, even those that are fairly natural, they're like, I can't go there. That price point's too low, And it's true. It does have a sort of a ceiling at the moment. I mean, there's brands that have transcended it. Gottagau out of Austria, and probably our own, Duncan and Nathan's place.
Arno Roberts.
Yeah, Arno Roberts.
Yeah.
I mean, they're getting good money. I wish I was getting that money, but I also don't, I don't understand that the way, that market and that they do. And so kudos to them. Those are probably the exceptions in general. Natural wine is not, the high ticket item for income.
Yeah. Are there any wines you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I would just say I talked about Laureate, the skin contacted shard and my experience with that since 2005, and also Ecstatic Consciousness, the 30-day macerated. But there's still a few 10-year releases that I try to always have one or two of those. And even though I sold, some of something, I might have 30 cases of it left, and so we'll go back to that. And I think those are fun to try because those are things that I think the younger palate doesn't understand yet, And this is, I have them here as a place to learn that, taste it. Again, it's not going to break the bank.
Yeah.
It's again not like buying, 20-year-old Barolo. But I think the value in aged wines doesn't exist in the California market. People don't think about that as much. Connoisseurs do, old connoisseurs, buying Burgundy and, again, Barolo and all that. But they're not thinking about that for California.
Yeah.
I mean, and even though they love their, those that love their Napa cabs, they're not looking at that necessarily as a 25-year wine. One of the best drinking experiences I ever had personally. And you got to understand, I was born and raised in the country. So, not a sommelier and my palate has never been as educated. When I go to the cities, I educate it, But even with that, a 1974 Mondavi Cabernet wasn't a reserve, wasn't anything special. My dad had it in the cellar. I expected it to be bad. Pulled it out with a bunch of other things. Whenever we'd get together, we'd pull out about 8 or 10 things, and maybe 2 of them, were good. And that was one of the best experiences I ever had. And it was 12% alcohol. You can't find a Cabernet in Napa that's 12% alcohol today. So, I think that shift is worth noting. And, and I'm making the whole spectrum of wines. So I've got, stuff that's aged. I've got longer maceration. I've got, rosé, which I hate using that term because it's either hot or it's off. And mostly it's off, right? I mean, there's people that love rosé, they always buy it. But in general, stores lament, it's not doing well now, so we're not buying it. Now we want to, sell it. And it's just whenever somebody hears that rosé is good, they go get it.
I think with rosé, it has the thing where people always want the previous years, and really it's so much better with some age.
Oh my God.
On it, like
Thank you
that's
for saying.
The freshness of it, I think, is the thing I don't like exactly with it a lot of times.
I mean, thank you for saying that. There's that, at the Hambone bars in New York, there's that one Spanish winery that their current release of whites is like 12 years. You know who this is? I'll let you think of it, but
I know who it is.
The rosé is like 8 years.
They make Tondonia.
Right. And the red is like 14 years.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, how do you even keep track of that? Like as a business, like what are you? But for me, fast forward to, I made a rosé, my first rosé, 2002, and I think it was 2010. So the rosé was 8 years old. 2010, I had a restaurateur from Louisiana visiting that sold the wines, and so we had like a 4-hour lunch, and I just kept going back to the cellar to get another thing, and I was pulling out just aardvarks for fun. And I found this one rosé, and I was like, "Oh, that's probably bad. Let's just pull that out. No sense storing that. We'll just pop a cork. If it's bad, at least we know it. We don't got to think about storing it." And it was a stopgap moment. It taught me so much. I was like, "Oh my God, light wines made right can age into something so beautiful." And it was, probably one of my favorite drinking experiences. I don't know if I've really ever loved my red wine's the same as that one, that vintage. So there's something really special about rosés as they can age. That doesn't have the same complexity though, so it was for the spot we were at, and the lunch was perfect. but I wouldn't want it with a bunch of food or something big, or whatever. Certainly with fish or something would be wonderful, but for that from appetizers on, maybe it's more red for me, but yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because it can be quite beautiful. It's just a matter of how was it made, and you don't know until you try it,
And I think natural wine in general, I think maybe people are starting to catch on that it can age. So, I mean, it's amazing that you have a library of 10-year-old wines, but I'm hopeful that I want to say it'll like catch on as a trend for producers to release that, because it's obviously a burden on the producer.
Yeah.
But just that people have that confidence that a natural wine can age, and that it doesn't have to be something you drink within a year or two.
Right. Like, I'm excited about what this market can be. For me, that's the whole thing. We're sort of slugging through what it's starting out as, and it's been like a 10 or 12 year startup. And, but it's developing into something so much more beautiful, and it, down the line should have so much more diversity in its offerings than it currently has, And there's those European wines that don't hang their hat on natural, that are, the heavier wine, the classic style, natural, and maybe there's sulfur added, but there's just so much out there that's already happening that isn't part of the whole conversation yet, And I just, in the next 10 years, it's incredible to think about what this can be, and we'll just see what happens, with our government and all that, and you know, I mean, there's always that, right? Just so at least we have this to enjoy for now.
For sure. Yeah. Is there anything we've kind of missed or glanced over or anything that?
It's nice to see someone hold a space of professionalism in a conversation sort of about art, I mean, really, it's, regenerative farming is really art. It's because regenerative farming is not engineering. It's not, even there's aspects of it that are like that. It's, to do it, you kind of have to have a leap of faith. It is an art form. Certainly it's going to be, turned into a recipe. I mean, it already has. And so farmers will just take the recipe and run with it, and the land will be better for it. But initiating the process when it's not widely done definitely is an art form where there's sort of, it's a bit faith-based as well,
right.
Like blind faith potentially, you just got to try it,
Yeah, when you don't have anybody that you can kind of like look over to and ask the questions to, it becomes a whole other thing.
Right. I mean,
kind of out there in the woods by yourself a little bit.
Right. I think that when we put our sign out front and it says natural wine, that's an eschewed thing, because that creates a problem. The problem for conventional wineries is someone comes into the tasting room that saw a sign that said natural and didn't see another sign and said, well, is this natural? That's the only reason they got the idea. And that creates an uncomfortable situation because there isn't that transparency, and the tasting room staff doesn't know what the hell it would be, how the wines are made, even themselves, let alone, the customer. So the winemaker is certainly not going to tell anybody that they put DMDC in the wine, leaves the methyl alcohol trace, and other things, they're just not, it's not something they want to admit. And at the same time, there are wineries who've made small changes and, changed some things, the whole sustainable effort, which, I don't have a whole lot of interest or good things to say about that, so I just pretty much don't say anything about it. But it did change a few things. Some of the clean tillage guys started to try every other row. They stopped tilling, right next to the creek. So there was some good out of it, however minor. And I think those minor changes are still there. It's just that what really needs to happen is we have to incentivize them, because we can never go to someone on their farm and twist their arm and tell them what they need to do. That ain't gonna work, man. That's what they fear the most, and you're gonna see a rifle in your nose, And so that's the energy that we're talking about. So I had created during the USDA's Climate Smart Commodities grant opening, I created a certification. We did a $2 million ask of them to do some training and schooling, but my vision was too small. It was one county.
Okay.
Which was big for me.
Yeah.
What won was the RCD's plan that was three counties, and they got 10 million.
Okay.
And that's what they wanted to fund. And so that was a beautiful idea. It was creating a marketing pathway, that was baked in. That's what the ask was, create a marketing pathway. The government at that time was enrolled in the idea of let's improve climate. Farming is a way to do that. Let's pay people. And so how do we just get this as a pass through? And so the Climate Smart Commodities gave like $2 billion, $2 billion, and which is an incredible thing, incredible. And so the RCD, the Resource Conservation District locally, got this money. I ended up being a consultant for them, and we were working on this thing and working on a pathway for the market and also a way to pay farmers to do it. Those are the two things that it takes. You gotta give them a better price. You gotta give them the understanding, the how-to, because they're afraid to jump ship, and these are the equipment they got, and they don't. It's got to cover the bottom. You can see a lot of fear in the farmer. There's a bottom line. They'll lose the property, and that means everything. So this beautiful idea was created, and of course it was canceled in spring. So for whatever way we're going backwards at the moment, that's just going to be what it is, and hopefully on another day we can get back to that good work to help farmers change into what we're seeing the trend in consumers is to want more of. Mm-hmm. Integrity in product, care of land, betterment of the climate situation. Well, what does that mean? That means less carbon going to the atmosphere. End of story right there. And also not just that, pulling carbon back down, which farms are capable of. So those are two things that are vital. And, it also paying farmers for pulling, let's create another value, pay them to sequester carbon and to not till and to not do so much damage, from these things. It's a great idea. But even within, what we call the environmentalist crowd, there's disagreements about that. They're like, well, if you pay someone to do good, then someone else gets a free pass on pollution. And I just am really disappointed in that conversation. I think that there's a misunderstanding. You have to fund the change to get the end that you want. It can't be just we're going to get everything we want. That ain't happening. That's never happened. So we got to fund the change and let it happen where it may. And where's it going to happen? It's going to happen from the industrial, because that's where the money's made. So anyway, there's all that. Get on my high, horse with that, because it's something I deeply believe in. Farmers know how much climate's changing. I make a regenerative soil amendment was the base of our ask of the USDA in how we could create that change, and we just hopefully one day that'll come back.
Amazing.
I just want to thank you for diving deep. A lot of conversations. I think the history is often missed, and I just appreciate you. You didn't really jump in and drive the conversation. You just beautifully offered and kind of let me run with it. For me, it's like I got so much experience to speak from. It's kind of hard to choose sometimes, and then I forget, as you see, where I'm going. Because I'm thinking about the next thing.
Yeah.
And so I just appreciate, being able to speak. I hope it's interesting to your listeners. And, I just thank you for bringing the conversation forward, because, I think that especially today, given what's happening with, government and all that, it's like the only time I really feel good is when I'm connecting with somebody, same wavelength, just, enjoying our time together. We got limited time. The moment is now. And so this was a conversation that I'm grateful to have had, and I hope your listeners feel the same.
I'm sure they will. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Appreciate that, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for listening today. Darek has been making some great and unique wines for a long time, including, as we discussed, the only Arboretum made in California. You can really feel his passion for health of the soil, body, mind, and world. You can find the wines at oldworldwinery.com or follow him on Instagram at oldworldwinery. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email IndieWinePodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast helps a lot too. There's also a Venmo for one-time donations if you don't want another subscription. I understand. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses, keeps it ad-free, available for everyone, and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.